The blood-red sunset painted the horizon as Rose Prescott's stagecoach rattled into Jamestown, Wyoming Territory. 1878, a town that promised nothing but bitter memories, and the wreckage of a life she'd tried desperately to leave behind. Rose clutched her worn leather satchel tighter against her chest as the stagecoach hit another rut in the dusty road. 3 years away hadn't changed the place much. The same weathered buildings lined the main street, the same saloon where her father had gambled away their ranch, and the same small church where she'd foolishly married Thomas Whitfield, the man who'd stolen everything from her, including her ability to trust. Jamestown, end of the line. The driver called, pulling the team to a halt outside the town's only hotel. Rose descended from the coach, her simple blue traveling dress catching the evening breeze. At 26, her face had lost the softness of youth, replaced by a determined set to her jaw and wariness in her hazel eyes. Her auburn hair was pinned severely at the nape of her neck, not a strand allowed to escape, just like her emotions. "Need help with your bags, madam?" the driver asked, already unloading her small trunk. "I can manage," she replied curtly, reaching for her belongings. The less assistance she needed from any man, the better. Suit yourself. The driver tipped his hat before climbing back onto his perch. Rose had barely taken 3 steps when a commotion erupted down the street. A man on horseback came galloping through town, pursued by another rider. As they thundered past, the lead rider's saddlebag burst open, spilling what appeared to be banknotes across the dusty street. "Stop, thief!" the second rider shouted. Without warning, a tall figure stepped out from between 2 buildings. He moved with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, positioning himself directly in the path of the escaping rider. In one swift motion, he grabbed the horse's bridle and yanked hard, causing the animal to rear. The thief tumbled backward off his mount, landing in an undignified heap in the dirt. Rose found herself frozen in place, watching as the stranger efficiently disarmed the fallen man and hauled him to his feet. The sheriff arrived moments later, clapping the tall man on the shoulder in gratitude. "Quick thinking as always, Nash," the sheriff said. "Been chasing this snake since Cheyenne." Nash. The name registered faintly in Rose's mind as she studied the man more carefully. Nash Irving stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders tapering to a lean waist. His face was all angles and planes, weathered by sun and wind, with piercing blue eyes beneath the brim of a battered brown Stetson. A thick mustache framed his upper lip, but it couldn't hide the slight smile that appeared as the sheriff congratulated him. Rose frowned. She'd heard that name before the new owner of the Circle M Ranch, which bordered what had once been her family's property. She'd also heard he was fair in his dealings, unlike most men of her acquaintance. Not that it mattered to her. She hadn't come back to Jamestown to make friends, especially not with a cowboy. She was here for one reason only: to reclaim what was rightfully hers. As if sensing her scrutiny, Nash Irving turned, his gaze locking with hers across the distance. Something flickered in those blue eyes, recognition, perhaps, though they'd never met. Or maybe it was just curiosity about the solitary woman standing amid the excitement with a trunk at her feet and wariness written across her features. Rose quickly averted her eyes and grabbed her trunk handle. She needed lodging for the night before she could begin her real work tomorrow, confronting the bank manager who had colluded with her ex-husband to steal her inheritance. The stranger's voice carried across the street. "Sheriff, I believe some of those banknotes blew this way." Rose glanced down and noticed several bills had indeed landed near her boots. Before she could react, Nash Irving was striding toward her, his long legs covering the distance with effortless ease. "Evening, madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Seems you've got some property of the Jamestown Bank at your feet." "I see that," Rose replied stiffly, stepping aside. He crouched to gather the notes, then straightened to his full height. This close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, laugh lines. Her mother would have called them, and the small scar that bisected his right eyebrow. "New to town?" he asked, tucking the retrieved money into his vest pocket. "Returning," she corrected, lifting her chin slightly. Not that it's any of your business, Mr. Irving. His eyebrows rose fractionally. You have me at a disadvantage. You know my name, but I don't believe I know yours. Rose Prescott. She offered nothing more, no explanation of who she was or why she'd returned. Recognition dawned in his eyes. Joseph Prescott's daughter, the same. Her voice grew colder. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to secure lodging for the night. Nash looked as if he wanted to say more, but instead he simply nodded and stepped back. The Jamestown Hotel has clean rooms. Mrs. Wilson runs a tight ship. I'm familiar with Mrs. Wilson's establishment, Rose replied, lifting her trunk once more. At least allow me to carry that for you, Nash offered, reaching for the handle. Rose pulled it away sharply. No, thank you. I've learned it's best to handle my own affairs. Something flickered in his eyes, not offense, but understanding. As you wish, Miss Prescott. Welcome back to Jamestown. As she walked away, Rose could feel his gaze following her. She straightened her shoulders and continued forward without looking back. She'd spent the last 3 years learning to stand on her own, to need no one, especially not a man. The fact that Nash Irving seemed decent enough changed nothing. She'd made that mistake once before, and it had cost her everything. The Jamestown Hotel hadn't changed much, the same faded wallpaper, the same creaking stairs. Mrs. Wilson, a plump woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and shrewd eyes, recognized Rose immediately. Rose Prescott, as I live and breathe, she exclaimed. When I heard you'd married that fancy man from back east and left town, I never thought we'd see you again. Life has a way of bringing us full circle, Mrs. Wilson, Rose replied, signing the guest register. I'll need a room for a few nights. The older woman's expression softened. Heard about what happened with that husband of yours. Terrible business. Rose's pen paused on the paper. News traveled fast in these parts, even from as far away as St. Louis. Yes, well, that's in the past. Of course, dear. Mrs. Wilson handed her a key. Room 4, upstairs on the right. Best view in the house. Thank you. Rose reached for her purse, but Mrs. Wilson waved her off. First nights on the house. Your father was always kind to me after my Samuel passed. It's the least I can do. Rose swallowed hard. Her father had been generous to a fault, too generous, perhaps. It was that very quality that had led him to trust Thomas Whitfield's investment schemes, the same schemes that had ultimately cost him his life when he discovered the truth. That's very kind, Rose managed to say, but I insist on paying my way. Mrs. Wilson's expression turned knowing. Independent now, are you? Well, can't fault a woman for that. 2 bits a night, then. Rose placed the coins on the counter and took her key. As she turned toward the stairs, the hotel door opened and Nash Irving entered, removing his hat as he stepped inside. Evening, Mrs. Wilson, he said, his deep voice carrying across the lobby. Got those supplies you ordered. My men are unloading them now. Bless you, Nash, the older woman replied warmly. Don't know what we'd do without you around here since the stage only comes through once a week. Rose tried to slip past unnoticed, but Nash turned as she approached the stairs. Miss Prescott, he acknowledged with a slight nod. Settled in, just on my way up, she replied, clutching the key tightly. Why did his presence make her so uneasy? Perhaps because, unlike most men she'd encountered, she couldn't immediately determine what he wanted from her. If you need anything while you're in town, the Circle M is just 3 miles west, he said. We're neighbors, after all. Rose couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped her. The Prescott land hasn't been mine for quite some time, Mr. Irving. I'm hardly your neighbor. His expression remained steady. The deed may have changed hands, but legacy runs deeper than paper, Miss Prescott. The simple statement caught her off guard. Before she could formulate a response, Mrs. Wilson interjected. Nash bought that property fair and square from the bank after that Whitfield fellow disappeared with the money. He's done wonders with it, too. Rose felt heat rising to her cheeks. I'm not disputing Mr. Irving's legal claim to the land, merely pointing out that I no longer have any connection to it. Nash studied her for a moment. The purpose of your return to Jamestown, might I ask what brings you back after all this time? You may ask, Rose replied coolly, but that doesn't oblige me to answer. To her surprise, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Fair enough. Good night, Miss Prescott. With that, he turned back to Mrs. Wilson, giving Rose the opportunity to escape upstairs with her dignity intact. Once inside her room, she set down her trunk and moved to the window. From here, she could see the main street of Jamestown, bathed in the dying light of sunset. In the distance, barely visible, was the outline of rolling hills that had once been Prescott land, her birthright. Stolen through deceit and betrayal. Rose pressed her hand against the cool glass. Tomorrow she would begin her investigation in earnest. The documents she discovered in St. Louis proof of her ex-husband's fraudulent dealings were safely tucked in her satchel. Thomas Whitfield might have disappeared with most of her family's money, but he'd made one critical mistake. He'd left a paper trail. And Rose intended to use that trail to reclaim what was hers, no matter who stood in her way, including the tall cowboy with the too perceptive blue eyes. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Rose dressed carefully in her most business-like attire, a tailored navy skirt and jacket over a crisp white shirtwaist. She arranged her hair in a practical chignon and donned a small hat. The effect was professional and severe, exactly the impression she wished to convey. After a quick breakfast in the hotel dining room, she made her way to the Jamestown Bank. The building stood on the corner of Main Street, its facade more imposing than she remembered. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through the heavy doors. Inside, two tellers worked behind a polished wooden counter. At the far end of the room, a glass-walled office housed the man she had come to see, Harold Winters, the bank manager who had facilitated her husband's theft. Rose approached one of the tellers. "I would like to speak with Mr. Winters, please." The young man glanced toward the office. "Do you have an appointment, madam?" "No, but I believe he'll see me. Tell him Rose Prescott is here." The teller's eyes widened slightly at her name. He hurried to the office, knocked, and entered. Through the glass, Rose could see him speaking to Winters, whose head snapped up at whatever the teller said. The bank manager's gaze found her through the glass, and even at this distance, she could see the color drain from his face. Good. He remembered her, and he was afraid. The teller returned. "Mr. Winters will see you now, Mrs. Whitfield." "It's Miss Prescott," she corrected firmly. "I no longer use my married name." She strode to the office, her heart pounding but her step unwavering. Harold Winters stood as she entered, a forced smile plastered on his thin face. "Rose," he began, extending his hand. What an unexpected surprise. She ignored his outstretched hand. "Mr. Winters, I believe we have business to discuss." His smile faltered. "Business?" "I wasn't aware." "Then allow me to enlighten you," Rose interrupted, opening her satchel. She removed a folder and placed several documents on his desk. "These are copies of transactions between you and my former husband, dating from 3 years ago. Transactions that illegally transferred my father's assets that should have passed to me upon his death into accounts that Thomas Whitfield controlled." Winters glanced at the papers, then back at her. "I don't know what you think these prove, but they prove fraud, Mr. Winters. They prove that you colluded with Thomas to steal my inheritance." She leaned forward, placing her hands on his desk. "And I intend to use them to reclaim what is rightfully mine." Winters' face hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Whitfield." Miss Prescott, he amended. "You should be careful about making such claims without proper legal counsel." "I've had 3 years to prepare, Mr. Winters. I've consulted attorneys in St. Louis. These documents have been reviewed by banking experts." She withdrew another paper from her folder. "This is a letter from the Territorial Banking Commission. They're quite interested in your activities." That got his attention. Winters reached for the letter, his hand trembling slightly. As he read, his complexion took on an ashen quality. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice now barely above a whisper. "I want what is mine," Rose replied evenly. "The deed to my father's land and an accounting of all funds that were misappropriated." Winters laughed nervously. "The land is gone, sold to settle debts. Nash Irving owns it now." "Then I want compensation for its value," Rose countered. "And don't pretend you don't have access to funds. I know exactly how much you skimmed from my father's accounts." The bank manager's eyes darted to the door as if calculating his escape routes. "This is absurd." "You have no proof I personally benefited." Page 4 of the documentation details deposits made to your personal account in Cheyenne, corresponding exactly with the dates of the fraudulent transfers," Rose said coldly. "You weren't as clever as you thought, Mr. Winters." A tense silence filled the room. Finally, Winters slumped back in his chair. "I'll need time to consider these allegations," he said weakly. Rose gathered her documents back into the folder. "You have until tomorrow morning. After that, I take these papers to Sheriff Cooper and the Banking Commission representative in Cheyenne." She stood to leave. "And Mr. Winters, don't mistake my gender for weakness. I will see justice done." With that, she turned and walked out, her heart hammering but her steps steady. The morning sun hit her face as she exited the bank, and she paused on the boardwalk, drawing a deep breath. The confrontation had gone as well as she could have hoped. Winters was cornered, and he knew it. "Miss Prescott." The familiar deep voice startled her. She turned to find Nash Irving leaning against a hitching post, watching her with those intent blue eyes. "Mr. Irving," she acknowledged stiffly. "Are you following me?" "Just happened to be heading to the bank myself when I saw you enter," he replied easily. "Judging by Winters' expression through the window, your meeting was productive." Rose studied him suspiciously. "My business with Mr. Winters is private, of course." Nash straightened, his tall frame casting a shadow across the boardwalk. "Though if it concerns the old Prescott property, it might eventually become my business too." Her eyes narrowed. "Why would you think that?" "Just a hunch," he said with a slight shrug. "You return after 3 years, head straight to the bank. It doesn't take much deduction." "Well, whatever you're thinking, Mr. Irving, I suggest you keep it to yourself," Rose said, moving past him. "Good day." "Wait," Nash called, falling into step beside her. "Let me buy you lunch." Rose stopped abruptly. "I beg your pardon, lunch," he repeated patiently. "It's midday, and Maggie's place across the street serves the best beef stew west of the Mississippi." "Why would you want to have lunch with me?" Rose asked suspiciously. Nash regarded her for a moment, his expression impossible to read. "Because you look like you could use a friendly ear, and because I have information that might interest you regarding Harold Winters." That caught her attention. "What kind of information?" "The kind best discussed over a meal," he replied. "What do you say, Miss Prescott?" 1 hour of your time in exchange for what might be valuable intelligence." Rose hesitated. Everything in her screamed to refuse to maintain the walls she'd built, but if Nash Irving had information about Winters— "Very well," she said finally. 1 hour. Maggie's Cafe was a small, clean establishment that smelled of fresh bread and simmering stew. Nash held the door for Rose, who entered with her head high and her guard higher. He guided her to a table near the back, away from the few other patrons. A plump woman with rosy cheeks approached, her face lighting up at the sight of Nash. "Well, if it isn't my favorite rancher, and with a lady friend no less." "Afternoon, Maggie," Nash greeted warmly. "This is Miss Rose Prescott." Miss Prescott, Maggie Davis, proprietor of the finest eating establishment in 3 counties. "Prescott," Maggie's eyes widened slightly. "Joseph's girl, my stars, you've grown into a beauty. Your pa was one of my best customers, God rest his soul." "Thank you, Mrs. Davis," Rose replied, softening slightly at the mention of her father. "2 specials, please, Maggie," Nash said, "and some of that apple pie if you've got it. Coming right up." Maggie bustled away, leaving them alone. Rose folded her hands on the table. "You mentioned information about Winters." Nash leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Direct and to the point, I appreciate that in a person. Mr. Irving, Nash, please." "Mr. Irving," she repeated firmly. "I didn't agree to lunch for small talk." He nodded, acknowledging her boundaries. "Fair enough." "Harold Winters is not what he appears to be. The respectable banker is merely a front. He's been involved in land swindles all across the territory." Rose's eyes narrowed. "How do you know this?" "Because I've been investigating him for the past year," Nash replied, lowering his voice. "On behalf of the territorial governor's office." That was the last thing she'd expected to hear. "You're, what, some kind of lawman?" "Not exactly. I own the Circle M Ranch legitimately, but I also work with the governor's office on special matters." Land fraud has become a serious problem in Wyoming Territory, and Winters is connected to much of it. Rose processed this information, her mind racing. If what you're saying is true, why haven't you arrested him already? We need evidence linking him to the larger operation, Nash explained. Winters is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle, which brings me to why I wanted to speak with you. He leaned forward. Those documents you showed him today, they might be the missing piece we need. Maggie arrived with 2 steaming bowls of stew and fresh bread, momentarily interrupting their conversation. When she'd gone, Rose dipped her spoon into the stew but didn't eat. How do you know what documents I showed him? She asked suspiciously. I don't know specifically, Nash admitted. But I saw his face when he was reading whatever you gave him. He looked terrified. Rose considered her options. If Nash was telling the truth, his resources could help her cause. If he was lying, well, she'd been deceived by experts before and had learned from the experience. My ex-husband, she corrected, worked with Winters to steal my inheritance after my father died. They falsified documents, transferred funds, and eventually forced the sale of my family's ranch to cover debts that didn't exist. Nash's expression darkened. Thomas Whitfield. You know him? By reputation only, Nash replied. He disappeared about 2 years ago, correct, after swindling several prominent families in St. Louis. Rose nodded, finally taking a spoonful of stew. It was as delicious as promised, but she barely tasted it. Yes. He vanished with most of my family's money, leaving me with nothing but debts and a ruined name. And you've spent the time since gathering evidence against him and Winters, Nash concluded. Impressive, necessary, Rose countered. I had to clear my name and recover what was stolen. Nash studied her for a long moment. We have a common enemy in Harold Winters, Miss Prescott. I propose we work together. Rose laughed without humor. Work together? Mr. Irving, with all due respect, I've learned the hard way not to trust men who make generous offers. I understand your caution, he said quietly. But consider this. Alone, you might force Winters to return some of what he stole from you. Together, we could bring down the entire operation and recover assets for dozens of victims across the territory. Rose set down her spoon. And what would you gain from this arrangement, Justice? Nash replied simply. And the satisfaction of completing my assignment, she shook her head. Justice is rarely so selfless a motivation in my experience. Nash leaned back, a hint of sadness crossing his features. Someone hurt you badly, Miss Prescott, not just financially, but here. He touched his chest over his heart. I'm sorry for that. The genuine sympathy in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, her carefully constructed walls wavered. I'll never trust a man again, she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Not with my money, not with my heart, not with anything. Nash held her gaze steadily. I wouldn't ask for your trust immediately. That would be foolish and disrespectful of what you've been through. Then what are you asking for? His expression softened. A chance to earn it day by day. Something about the simple sincerity in those words reached a part of Rose she'd thought long dead. Still, caution prevailed. Fine, she said finally, we'll share information. But I maintain control of my evidence and my case against Winters. Nash nodded. Agreed. Should we seal the deal? He extended his hand across the table. Rose hesitated only briefly before shaking it. His hand was warm and calloused, a working man's hand, strong but careful not to grip her too tightly. Now, he said, releasing her hand, tell me about these documents you've collected. What exactly do they prove? As they finished their meal, Rose outlined what she had discovered during her 3-year investigation: the falsified loan documents, the mysterious transfers, the pattern of fraud that had ultimately led to the loss of her family's ranch. The Prescott property was one of the most valuable in the county, Nash commented. Prime grazing land, good water access. My grandfather chose it carefully when he settled here in '42, Rose said, a hint of pride in her voice. Built it up from nothing. And your father continued the tradition, Rose nodded, her expression softening at the memory. He loved that land more than anything. When Mother died, it became his whole world and mine. She looked up suddenly, as if remembering who she was speaking to. And now you own it. Nash met her gaze evenly. I paid a fair price to the bank had I known the circumstances. It doesn't matter now, Rose said, gathering herself. What matters is making Winters and his associates pay for what they've done. On that, we are in complete agreement. Nash signaled to Maggie for the bill. What's your next move? I've given Winters until tomorrow morning to respond to my demands, Rose explained. Based on his reaction today, I expect him to try something desperate before then. Nash frowned. You shouldn't return to the hotel alone. Winters might send someone to intimidate you or worse. Rose's chin lifted defiantly. I can take care of myself, Mr. Irving. I've been doing so for 3 years now. I don't doubt your capability, he replied calmly, but even the most capable person can be overwhelmed by numbers. At least allow me to escort you back to the hotel and check that your room is secure. Rose wanted to refuse on principle, but his logic was sound. Very well, but just to the hotel lobby. After Nash paid for their meal despite her protests, they walked back to the Jamestown hotel. The afternoon sun beat down on the dusty street, and Rose was uncomfortably aware of the glances they received from townspeople. No doubt by evening, gossip would be circulating about Rose Prescott and Nash Irving dining together. As they approached the hotel, a commotion down the street caught their attention. A man was running full tilt toward them with Sheriff Cooper in pursuit. Stop him, the sheriff shouted. Bank robbery, the fleeing man spotted Rose and Nash blocking his path. Rather than change direction, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a revolver. Get down, Nash ordered, shoving Rose behind him and reaching for his own weapon. The robber fired wildly, the shot going wide. Before he could squeeze off another round, Nash had drawn and fired in one fluid motion. The robber cried out, his gun falling from his hand as he clutched his shoulder and stumbled. Sheriff Cooper was on him in an instant, wrestling him to the ground and slapping handcuffs on his wrists. You all right, Nash? Cooper called, hauling the wounded man to his feet. We're fine, Nash replied, holstering his weapon and turning to Rose. Are you hurt? She shook her head, momentarily speechless. The speed with which Nash had reacted, the precision of his shot wounding rather than killing spoke of years of experience. You've done that before, she observed quietly. A shadow crossed his face. More times than I care to remember, Sheriff Cooper approached, dragging the prisoner with him. Much obliged for the assistance, Nash. Miss Prescott, I hope you weren't too frightened. I'm fine, Sheriff, Rose assured him, finding her voice. Though I'm curious what bank was robbed, I was just at the Jamestown bank this morning. Winters Bank, Cooper confirmed. This fella and another one burst in about 20 minutes ago. The other one got away with most of the money. Rose and Nash exchanged a significant look. Interesting timing, Nash commented once the sheriff had moved on with his prisoner. Very, Rose agreed. A robbery immediately after I confront Winters with evidence of his fraud. Too convenient to be coincidence, Nash concluded. He's cleaning out his accounts before fleeing. The robbery provides cover for the missing funds. Rose's eyes widened as the implications became clear. We need to stop him before he gets away. I believe you're right. Nash's expression turned grim. And I think I know where he might be headed. The afternoon stage to Cheyenne leaves in an hour. Without further discussion, they hurried toward the stagecoach office at the far end of town. Rose had to lift her skirts slightly to keep pace with Nash's long strides, but she didn't complain or ask him to slow down. The stagecoach office was a small building next to the livery stable. When they entered, a balding clerk looked up from his ledger. Afternoon, Mr. Irving, madam. What can I do for you? Has Harold Winters booked passage on today's stage to Cheyenne? Nash asked directly. The clerk frowned. I couldn't say, sir. Customer information is confidential. This is a matter of territorial security, Nash interrupted, reaching into his vest and producing a folded document. I'm acting under the authority of the governor's office. The clerk examined the document with wide eyes. I see, sir. Yes, Mr. Winters did purchase a ticket earlier today, said he had urgent business in Cheyenne. I'll bet he did, Rose muttered. Is there a back way out of here? Nash asked the clerk. Yes, sir, through the livery. Nash turned to Rose. He'll likely come in that way to avoid being seen. The rear door opened suddenly, and Harold Winters himself appeared, carrying a small valise. He froze at the sight of Nash and Rose. "Going somewhere, Winters?" Nash asked pleasantly. The banker's eyes darted between them and the door. "Business in Cheyenne, nothing unusual." "Fleeing after staging a robbery at your own bank seems quite unusual to me," Rose countered, stepping forward. "As does absconding with stolen funds." Winters' face contorted with rage. "You think you're so clever, don't you, both of you, but you have no idea who you're dealing with." "Oh, I think we do," Nash replied calmly. "A coward and a thief who preys on the vulnerable and steals their livelihoods." Winters lunged suddenly, shoving past the startled clerk and bolting for the front door. Nash moved to intercept him, but the banker was surprisingly quick for his age and build. As he reached the doorway, he collided with a tall figure entering from outside. "Sheriff Cooper," Winters gasped, stumbling backward. "Mr. Winters," the sheriff replied, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "Funny thing, that bank robber we caught started talking, said you hired him and his partner to stage the robbery, said it was all arranged last night after a lady in blue visited you at the bank." Winters' shoulders sagged in defeat. "Harold Winters," the sheriff continued formally, "I'm arresting you on suspicion of bank fraud, conspiracy to commit robbery, and embezzlement of bank funds." He looked past the banker to Nash. "I take it this is connected to your investigation," Nash nodded. "Miss Prescott here has evidence linking Winters to a series of fraudulent land deals, including the theft of her family's property." Cooper's eyebrows rose. "That's so? Well, Miss Prescott, I'll need to see that evidence when you have a moment." "Of course, Sheriff," Rose replied, unable to keep a note of satisfaction from her voice. "I'll bring everything to your office this afternoon." As Cooper led Winters away, the banker turned back, his face twisted with malice. "This isn't over," he hissed at Rose. "You have no idea what you've started." "No, Mr. Winters," she replied steadily. "This is exactly what I came here to finish." When they were alone again, Nash turned to Rose with newfound respect in his eyes. "You were right about him trying something desperate." "I didn't expect a staged robbery, though. Men like Winters and my ex-husband always believe they're the cleverest person in the room," Rose said bitterly. "That arrogance makes them predictable." Nash studied her for a moment. "What will you do now?" "With Winters arrested, your path to justice is clear." Rose hadn't thought that far ahead. For 3 years, her sole focus had been gathering evidence and returning to Jamestown to confront Winters. Now that it was done, she felt strangely adrift. "I don't know," she admitted. "See the case through, I suppose. Make sure Winters faces consequences for what he did to my father, to me." "And after that," Nash pressed gently. Rose met his gaze, struck again by the genuine interest in those blue eyes. "I haven't allowed myself to think about after. Vengeance has consumed my life for so long." "Well," Nash said, offering her his arm as they exited the stage coach office, "perhaps now you can start thinking about it." After a moment's hesitation, Rose placed her hand lightly on his arm. It was a small gesture, but for a woman who had sworn never to trust a man again, it represented a tentative first step. "Perhaps," she agreed softly. Over the next few days, Rose worked closely with Sheriff Cooper and Nash to organize the evidence against Harold Winters. The banker was being held in the Jamestown jail, awaiting transport to Cheyenne for trial. Rose's documentation, combined with the confession of the captured bank robber, had created a solid case. What surprised Rose most during this time was Nash Irving's consistent support. He introduced her to the territorial prosecutor, helped her organize her evidence, and even arranged for her to meet with the governor's representative who came to Jamestown to investigate the case. Each interaction with Nash challenged her preconceptions. He never pressured her, never imposed his views, and most importantly, never treated her as anything less than an equal partner in their shared goal of bringing Winters to justice. 5 days after Winters' arrest, Rose was summoned to the sheriff's office. She arrived to find Nash already there, along with Sheriff Cooper and a distinguished-looking gentleman in an expensive suit. "Miss Prescott," Cooper greeted her. "This is Judge William Hargrove from the Territorial Court. He's here about the Winters case." Judge Hargrove stepped forward, extending his hand. Miss Prescott, I've reviewed your evidence. Most impressive work. Thank you, Your Honor, Rose replied, shaking his hand. I've also spoken at length with Mr. Irving about his investigation. The judge glanced at Nash. Between the two of you, you've uncovered what appears to be one of the most extensive land fraud schemes in territorial history. Has Winters confessed? Rose asked. Sheriff Cooper nodded. Started singing like a canary yesterday. Named names, dates, everything. Including details about your ex-husband's involvement. Rose's heart skipped a beat. Thomas, what did he say? The men exchanged glances, and it was Nash who answered. Whitfield was Winters' partner in several schemes, including what happened with your father's property. But according to Winters, Whitfield double-crossed him about a year ago, taking most of their ill-gotten gains and disappearing. Which matches what you discovered in St. Louis, Judge Hargrove added. Rose processed this information. So Thomas is still out there somewhere. For now, Nash said grimly, but with what we now know, it's just a matter of time before he's found. Judge Hargrove cleared his throat. That brings me to why I asked to see you, Miss Prescott. In light of the evidence, the territorial court is prepared to restore ownership of your family's property to you with appropriate compensation for losses incurred. Rose blinked in surprise. But the land was sold. Mr. Irving now owns it. All eyes turned to Nash, who smiled slightly. I purchased the property from the bank in good faith, but knowing what I know now, I cannot in good conscience retain ownership of land that was stolen from your family through fraud. You're giving it back? Rose asked, incredulous. It's the right thing to do, Nash replied simply. Judge Hargrove pulled some documents from his briefcase. Mr. Irving has agreed to relinquish his claim to the original Prescott property. The court will compensate him for his purchase price, and you, Miss Prescott, will have your family home returned to you. Rose felt lightheaded. After 3 years of fighting, of building walls around her heart, of trusting no one, she was going to get her land back. And it was largely due to the man standing across from her, the man she'd been determined to dislike on principle. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. Say you'll accept, Nash suggested gently. Rose nodded, unable to speak. Excellent, Judge Hargrove said, laying out the papers. If you'll both sign these documents, we can make it official. As Rose signed her name to the papers that would restore her birthright, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, the burden of vengeance she'd carried for so long. When Nash signed after her, officially relinquishing his claim to the land, she found herself studying his profile. The strong jaw, the hint of silver at his temples, the quiet dignity in his bearing. Thank you, she said softly when they'd finished. Nash met her gaze. No thanks necessary, it wasn't mine to keep. Later that afternoon, Nash offered to drive Rose out to see the property. They rode in his buckboard wagon, traveling the familiar road west of town that Rose had traveled countless times as a girl. I should warn you, Nash said as they neared the old Prescott ranch, I've made some changes to the property since acquiring it. Rose braced herself, unsure what to expect. When they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, she gasped. The old Prescott farmhouse, which had been in disrepair when she left, had been completely restored. The faded wood was now painted a clean white, the sagging porch repaired and extended across the front of the house. New outbuildings dotted the property, and fat cattle grazed in fields that had once stood empty. You rebuilt it, Rose whispered. Nash guided the wagon toward the house. When I bought the place, it was in bad shape. I couldn't bear to see good land and a good house go to waste. It's beautiful, Rose said, tears pricking at her eyes. Better than it ever was when I was a girl. Nash pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. The Circle M hands have been maintaining it. I'll have them clear out by tomorrow. Rose turned to him, suddenly realizing something. Your ranch, you'll be losing a significant portion of your grazing land, Nash shrugged. I still have the western parcels I purchased separately, it's enough. But you've put so much work into this place, Rose protested. The house, the barn, the fences. Consider it an investment in the property's rightful owner, Nash replied with a small smile. Besides, I have a feeling my new neighbor will be reasonable about grazing rights. Neighbor, The word struck Rose anew. She would indeed be Nash Irving's neighbor now. He helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. When her feet touched the ground, he didn't immediately step back, and for a moment they stood close together, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. "Would you like to see inside?" Nash asked, breaking the spell. Rose nodded, following him up the porch steps. The front door opened into the familiar main room of her childhood home, but like the exterior, the interior had been transformed. The old, worn furnishings were gone, replaced with solid, well-crafted pieces. The wooden floors gleamed with polish and new curtains hung at the windows. "I kept the original layout," Nash explained as she wandered through the space. But the roof needed replacing and some of the floor joists were rotted. Rose ran her hand along the mantel of the stone fireplace, the one feature that remained exactly as she remembered it. Her father had built this fireplace himself, hauling each stone from the creek bed. "It's perfect," she said, her voice catching. "I never thought I'd see this place again, let alone find it so beautifully cared for." Nash watched her from the doorway, his expression soft. "It deserved to be cared for, as do you, Rose." The use of her given name, spoken in his deep voice, sent an unexpected warmth through her. For 3 years she had been Miss Prescott, or worse, Mrs. Whitfield. To be simply Rose again in her family home was a gift she hadn't known she needed. "I don't know how to thank you," she said honestly. "You already have," Nash replied, "seeing you here where you belong. That's thanks enough." As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the windows, they sat on the front porch swing another of Nash's additions and talked. Rose found herself sharing stories of her childhood on the ranch, of her father's dreams for the property, of the life she'd envisioned before Thomas Whitfield had appeared and changed everything. In turn, Nash told her about growing up in Colorado, the son of a mine foreman who had saved enough to buy a small cattle operation. How he'd worked the family ranch until his parents passed, then sold it to pursue larger opportunities in Wyoming. How he'd served briefly as a deputy U.S. Marshal before accepting his current role with the governor's office, investigating land fraud throughout the territory. "Is that why you bought this place?" Rose asked. "As part of your investigation," Nash shook his head. "No. I bought it because the moment I rode onto this land, I knew it was special. There's something about the way the hills cradle the valley, the way the creek runs clear all year. It felt like home." He glanced at her. "Now I understand why. It was built and tended with love." As darkness fell, Rose realized with surprise how comfortable she felt in Nash's presence. The walls she'd built around her heart hadn't exactly crumbled, but they'd developed a small opening just enough to let in a ray of light. "I should get you back to town," Nash said eventually, standing and offering her his hand. Rose took it, rising from the swing. "When can I move in?" "Tomorrow, if you'd like," he replied. "I'll send some men over in the morning to make sure everything is ready for you." On the ride back to Jamestown, they traveled mostly in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When Nash helped Rose down from the wagon in front of the hotel, their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for today," Rose said softly, "for everything." Nash studied her face in the lamplight spilling from the hotel windows. "This is just the beginning, Rose, of justice, of healing, of whatever comes next." "Whatever comes next," she repeated, the phrase both frightening and exhilarating. "Good night, Nash. Good night, Rose." As she watched him drive away, Rose realized something had shifted inside her. The bitter vow she'd made 3 years ago never to trust a man again had begun to loosen its grip on her heart. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Rose packed her few belongings, paid Mrs. Wilson, and waited on the hotel porch for Nash, who had promised to drive her to the ranch. When his wagon appeared, she was surprised to see it loaded with supplies. "What's all this?" she asked as he helped her up onto the seat. "Housewarming gifts," Nash replied with a smile. "Flour, coffee, preserves, some basic provisions to get you started." "That's very thoughtful," Rose said, touched by the gesture. "Mrs. Wilson and Maggie contributed most of it," Nash admitted. "Word got around town that you're reclaiming your family home. People remember your father fondly." As they drove through Jamestown, several townspeople called out greetings or waved. Rose was startled by the warm reception so different from the suspicious glances she'd received upon her arrival just a week ago. "People respect what you've done," Nash explained, noting her surprise. "Standing up to Winters, helping bring down a criminal operation that's been preying on folks around here for years." When they arrived at the ranch, Rose was further surprised to find several men at work repairing a section of fence, mucking out the barn, and preparing the chicken coop. "My hands," Nash explained. "I hope you don't mind. I thought you might appreciate a little help getting the place ready." "Mind, it's incredibly generous," Rose replied. One of the men approached a weathered cowboy with a friendly smile. "Morning, boss, madam." "Pete, this is Miss Rose Prescott, the rightful owner of this property," Nash introduced them. "Rose, this is Pete Daniels, my foreman." "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Prescott," Pete said, tipping his hat. "Heard a lot about you." "All good, I hope," Rose replied with a smile. "Yes, madam," Pete confirmed. "Boss hasn't talked about much else this past week." Nash cleared his throat, looking slightly embarrassed. "Pete exaggerates." "Only when I'm lying, which I ain't," Pete retorted good-naturedly. "Miss Prescott, we've got the house all cleaned up, fresh linens on the beds and the pantry stocked, stoves lit and heating nicely." "Thank you," Rose said sincerely. "I don't know how to repay such kindness." Pete waved away her thanks. "Just being neighborly, madam. Besides, any friend of the boss is a friend of ours." As Pete returned to his work, Nash helped Rose down from the wagon. "I hope it's not too much," he said quietly. "I didn't want to overstep." "It's perfect," Rose assured him. "I was dreading the thought of coming back to an empty house with so much work ahead of me." They carried her trunk and the supplies into the house. True to Pete's word, the place was immaculate, with a cheerful fire burning in the kitchen stove and fresh wildflowers in a jar on the table. "Your men did all this?" Rose asked, deeply moved. Nash nodded. "They wanted to, like Pete said, being neighborly." Rose turned to him, suddenly overwhelmed by emotion. 1 week ago, she had arrived in Jamestown hardened by betrayal, trusting no one, expecting to fight alone. Now here she stood in her family home, surrounded by kindness she hadn't sought but desperately needed. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, blinking back tears. Nash stepped closer, his eyes gentle. "You don't need to say anything, Rose, just allow yourself to accept that not everyone wants something from you. Some people just want to help because it's the right thing to do." "People like you?" she asked softly. "I hope so," he replied. In that moment, with sunlight streaming through the windows of her childhood home and this good man standing before her, Rose felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. The days that followed settled into a comfortable rhythm. Rose threw herself into learning the operations of the ranch, determined to make it successful once more. Nash proved an invaluable resource, offering advice when asked but never imposing his views. 2 weeks after moving into her home, Rose invited Nash to dinner, her first attempt at entertaining since returning. She spent the afternoon preparing, baking bread and cooking a beef stew using her mother's recipe. When Nash arrived, bearing a bottle of wine and a small bouquet of wildflowers, Rose felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. "Something smells wonderful," he said as she welcomed him inside. "My mother's stew recipe," Rose explained, taking the flowers with a smile. "I haven't cooked it in years." "I'm honored to be your test subject," Nash replied. They sat at the kitchen table, talking easily as they ate. Rose found herself laughing at Nash's stories of cattle drives gone wrong and the antics of his ranch hands. In turn, she shared tales of her time in St. Louis, working as a clerk in a lawyer's office while secretly gathering evidence against Thomas and Winters. As they finished the meal, Nash grew more serious. "I received a telegram from Denver today," he said. "Thomas Whitfield has been spotted there." Rose set down her wineglass, her heart racing. "Are they going to arrest him?" "They're watching him for now," Nash explained. "He's meeting with known associates of the land fraud ring. The territorial governor wants to gather evidence against all of them before making arrests." Rose nodded slowly. "Good, I want them all to face justice, not just Thomas." Nash studied her across the table. "You've changed since you arrived in Jamestown." Have I? You're less guarded, he observed. When you first stepped off that stagecoach, you looked ready to do battle with the entire town. Rose smiled slightly. I was. And now, she considered the question, now I still want justice, but I'm beginning to remember there's more to life than vengeance. Nash reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. I'm glad to hear that. After dinner, they moved to the porch swing, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The evening was warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of grass and wildflowers. I've been thinking, Nash said after a comfortable silence, about our arrangement regarding grazing rights. Oh, Rose turned to face him. Is there a problem? Not at all, but I have a proposal that might benefit us both. Nash outlined a plan to share certain resources, water rights, grazing areas, even labor during busy seasons. It would make both our operations more efficient. Rose listened, impressed by the thoughtfulness of his proposal. It makes good business sense, she agreed. I accept, Nash smiled. Good, I was hoping you would. There's one more thing I'd like to discuss if you're willing. Something in his tone made Rose's pulse quicken. What is it? Nash turned toward her on the swing, his expression earnest. Over these past few weeks, I've come to admire you greatly, Rose. Your strength, your determination, your kindness despite everything you've been through. Rose felt her cheeks warm. Nash, please let me finish, he said gently. I know you've been hurt. I know you vowed never to trust a man again, and I respect that, but I want you to know that I care for you more than as a neighbor or a business partner. Rose's heart hammered in her chest. Part of her wanted to retreat behind her walls to protect herself from the possibility of more pain. But another part, a part that had been slowly awakening since that day in Maggie's cafe, yearned to take the risk. I'm scared, she admitted softly. Not of you, but of feeling something again, of being vulnerable. Nash nodded, understanding in his eyes. I'm not asking for declarations or promises, Rose, just permission to call on you properly, to court you if you're willing. Court me, Rose repeated, a small smile playing at her lips despite her anxiety. That sounds rather old-fashioned. I'm an old-fashioned man, Nash replied with a smile of his own. Rose took a deep breath. I vowed never to trust a man again, she said softly. I know, Nash acknowledged, but I'm beginning to think. Rose hesitated, gathering her courage that maybe the right man might be worth the risk. If he's patient, if he understands that trust has to be earned, I'll earn it, Nash promised, his voice low and sincere, day by day. In the soft glow of twilight, Rose made a decision. She reached out and took Nash's hand, feeling its strength and warmth. I'd like that, she said simply. Nash's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek. Thank you, he murmured. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, hands entwined, Rose felt the last of her bitter vow begin to dissolve. The past could not be erased, but perhaps the future held more promise than she had dared to hope. Over the following months, true to his word, Nash courted Rose with patience and respect. There were picnics by the creek that ran through both their properties, Sunday drives into town for church and dinner at Maggie's, and long evenings on the porch swing, talking until the stars filled the sky. Each thoughtful gesture, each kept promise, each moment of respect for her boundaries chipped away at the walls around Rose's heart. Nash never pushed, never presumed, never made her feel that her caution was unwarranted. In July, news came that Thomas Whitfield and his associates had been arrested in Denver. Rose testified at the trial, facing her ex-husband across the courtroom with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Nash sat behind her every day, a steady presence at her back. When Thomas was sentenced to 15 years in prison for fraud and embezzlement, Rose felt not triumph but relief, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It's finally over, she said to Nash as they left the courthouse in Cheyenne. How do you feel? He asked, studying her face. Rose considered the question. Free, she said finally, ready to look forward instead of back. Nash smiled, offering her his arm. I'm glad to hear that. That evening, as they sat in the hotel restaurant, Nash reached across the table and took her hand. Rose, there's something I want to ask you. Her heart skipped a beat at the seriousness in his tone. "Yes, these past months have been the happiest of my life," he began, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Getting to know you, watching you rebuild your life and your ranch." "It's been a privilege," Rose smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "For me as well." Nash took a deep breath. "I love you, Rose. I think I've loved you since that day you stood up to Harold Winters, fire in your eyes and steel in your spine." Tears welled in Rose's eyes. "Nash." "You don't need to say it back," he assured her quickly. "I know trust comes harder for you, and rightly so. I just wanted you to know how I feel." Rose squeezed his hand. "I do trust you," she said softly, the realization dawning as she spoke the words. "Day by day, just as you promised, you've earned it." Nash's eyes brightened with hope. "Then, might I ask another question?" Rose nodded, her heart pounding. Nash reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "Rose Prescott, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. Rose looked from the ring to Nash's face, seeing all the love and hope written there. The walls around her heart, once so impenetrable, had crumbled completely under his patient care. "Yes," she whispered, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "Yes, I will marry you." Nash slipped the ring onto her finger, then raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "You've made me the happiest man in the territory." That night, standing on the hotel balcony under a canopy of stars, Nash kissed her for the first time, a kiss filled with promise and tenderness. As Rose melted into his embrace, she marveled at how far she had come from that bitter, wounded woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Jamestown. "I love you," she murmured against his lips, the words she'd thought she'd never say again flowing naturally from her heart. "I love you, Nash Irving." They married in October when the aspen trees had turned to gold and the air held the first hint of winter's approach. The ceremony took place at the small church in Jamestown, attended by friends they'd made and Nash's ranch hands, who had become like family to them both. Rose wore a simple ivory gown with her mother's lace veil, and Nash cut a handsome figure in his best suit. As they exchanged vows, Rose looked into the eyes of the man who had patiently earned her trust, day by day, and knew she had found her home. The celebration afterward was held at the Prescott Ranch, now the Irving Prescott Ranch, as they had decided to combine their operations as well as their lives. Lanterns hung from the trees, tables groaned with food contributed by townsfolk, and music filled the air as guests danced in the yard. As twilight fell, Nash led Rose away from the festivities to a quiet spot by the creek. "Happy, Mrs. Irving?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "You know, when I made that vow never to trust a man again, I truly believed it. I couldn't imagine ever letting someone past my defenses. And now," Nash pressed a kiss to her temple. Rose turned in his arms, looking up at the face she had come to love so dearly. "Now I understand that the right kind of love doesn't demand trust, it earns it, every day in 1,000 small ways." Nash smiled, touching his forehead to hers. "And I'll keep earning it, Rose, every day for the rest of our lives." As the stars appeared overhead and the sounds of celebration drifted on the evening breeze, Rose sealed his promise with a kiss, grateful for the man who had shown her that even the most wounded heart could learn to trust again. 5 years later, Rose sat on the porch swing, watching as Nash taught their 4-year-old son Joseph how to ride his new pony in the yard. Their 2-year-old daughter Lily sat on Rose's lap, clapping her hands in delight at her brother's antics. "Look, Mama, I'm doing it," Joseph called, his face alight with pride as he balanced on the gentle pony's back. "Wonderful, darling," Rose called back, her heart swelling with love. Nash walked alongside the pony, one hand ready to steady Joseph if needed, but giving the boy enough freedom to feel the accomplishment of riding on his own. It was how Nash approached everything in life, offering support without smothering, guidance without control. The Irving Prescott Ranch had prospered under their joint management, becoming one of the most successful operations in the county. They had expanded their herd, improved their breeding stock, and even experimented with new farming techniques in the fertile valley land. But their greatest achievement, Rose reflected as she watched her husband and son, was the family they had built, a family founded on love, respect, and trust that had been earned day by day. Thinking deep thoughts, my love. Nash asked as he approached the porch, Joseph having dismounted to lead his pony to the water trough. Just counting my blessings, Rose replied, making room for him on the swing beside her. They're too numerous to finish the task. Nash settled beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders and dropping a kiss on Lily's dark curls. I know the feeling. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Rose leaned against her husband's solid strength, content in the knowledge that the bitter vow she'd made so long ago had been replaced by a far sweeter promise to love and be loved, to trust and be worthy of trust, every day for the rest of their lives. And Nash, true to his word, continued to earn that trust day by day.